Welcome, everybody, to the American Space Museum. I'm Mark Marquette. We're so glad you're with us to stay curious today with Rick Davignon. Welcome, Rick.
Glad to be here.
We're glad to have you here. Marty will put his name down there on the bottom. Davignon, like filet mignon, you told me there. And believe me, this guy's had a stellar career. 30 years with the shuttle program, and I'm interested to hear about the 14 years he spent with the 45th Space Wing, and he's also going to tell us a little bit about your aviation career. Rick, tell us a little bit. Our Stay Curious watchers love everything about aviation. As I'm looking behind me here, let me move a little bit further away. We got the Space Shuttle at the Slick 6 launch pad of Vandenberg, California, and you were out there part of your career wanting to launch a shuttle out there. So tell us a little about yourself. Where'd you grow up and how'd you get in this business?
Okay, I was a very poor Kansas farm boy that grew up on a farm in northwest Kansas, halfway between Denver and Kansas City. And had to be a vortex near there where airplanes flew over leaving contrails all the time. So I first got interested in aviation, and then when they had the Glenn and Shepard flights, watched that on the original flights on black and white TV.
So here you are as a young man there. What's this an application for?
Actually, that's I was a member of 4-H clubs and FFA and all those other things as a kid growing up, and that's a picture I think when I was about 9, and that's a page out of my old 4-H book.
Awesome to look back at that stuff back then. Bill, and those were some real good organizations you mentioned. 4-H was kind of a rural kids thing. Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, a lot of activities to get involved to keep us out of trouble back in the 60s and 50s, right?
Yes, and the interesting thing about it was growing up on a farm, we had to learn how to fix things on our own. You didn't have access. I mean, it was 10 miles to a really small town. So we learned how to fix things ourselves, and I was taught to weld and do all kinds of things as a kid. It paid off very well, including some of the things I learned on how to maintain stuff in general. Helped a great deal in doing operations on the shuttle, surprising enough.
Well, I'm not surprised because Story Musgrave, certainly you know that astronaut, he wanted to take a come-along with him on the Hubble repair mission. Saying he didn't know what was going to get into, and they ended up using that to close the door on the shuttle because it was warped.
Yeah.
So that good old farm boy stuff works out good. Another farm boy we'll give a shout out to is Mr. Lee Solid of the Rocketdyne Rockets there. He grew up on a farm too. So, well, you got 3-room elementary school. That's interesting. And you are a Purdue graduate, huh?
Yes,
Boil her up.
Yeah, I went to a very rural country school, very small classes, and the big school I went to was high school at the county seat, and I had a big senior class of 61 students.
Oh my gosh!
You know, compared to most places, that's just awfully remote. And but I was very good at math and science and interested in space, so I applied to a lot of the aerospace programs around the country, and I got selected to go to Purdue. And they had a great program there. In fact, Neil Armstrong and Gus Grissom both went to Purdue. I don't know if you remember that, but
I do. There's 24 Purdue knots out there. Jerry Ross is another one, and so many of them. My grandfather went to Purdue at the turn of the century there. Old Mel Marquette did. Well, you got into the Vietnam era out there, you and Marty both. Thank you for your service to our country in Vietnam. It wasn't the prettiest of conflicts and so forth, but I got here in your notes you were draft number lottery 86. Hex, boy, that was certainly sent you to the recruitment office, I guess.
Well, and the kind of unique thing about that was in the late 60s and early 70s when I was at the university studying aerospace engineering, I had my eyes set on being an aerospace engineer and actually coming to KSC and launch, if you will. But I got this draft number my senior year, and it had already eclipsed that spring, and I got called up for draft physical, so no, I knew I was going in the military, and nobody talked to me about a job. So I went down and signed up in the Air Force and to go to flight school. And I was lucky enough I went to undergraduate flight school in Reef Air Force Base, which is right outside Lubbock, Texas. It's since been closed, but I flew T-38s there, same airplane the astronauts do. That particular airplane's been a real workhorse. It's still flying today.
There's that T-38.
And it's like 60 years old.
I didn't realize it was 60 years old. The taxi for astronauts to go around the contractors.
It first flew in 1961.
My gosh.
And that was T-38As that I flew. They've been upgraded with avionics, including GPS and the modern stuff. And they're C models with avionics upgrade. And they have a replacement. Boeing actually has a contract to replace that with a new aircraft that looks similar sized, called the T-7. But it's not ready to go yet. They were hoping to bring it on in 23, but I don't think they're going to quite make that next year. So. But anyway.
That's interesting, Rick, because that is an iconic spacecraft in American space history, no doubt about it. The astronauts could go back and forth from Houston to Cape or Kennedy Space Center. What is it, a little over an hour and 20-minute flight?
Yeah, it typically cruised around 480 at altitude, something like that. It was a real quick airplane.
And they used it to go to contractors to check out the work that they were involved with on building the shuttle or maintaining it.
And it was a really, it's like driving a sports car. It was really a nice hot rod airplane to go fly in.
Well, it looks sexy as can be and like a sports car. So, but that's interesting that they're going to replace it as early as next year. Well, here's one of the great aircraft of our time, the F-4.
Yeah, after I got out of flight school, I was selected to go fly the F-4 Phantom. And I initially had orders to go to Thailand, but the war was winding down in 74 by the time I got through undergraduate flight school. And I ended up getting those orders amended and got sent to RAF Lakenheath in England. And we flew all over Europe while I was there. This picture here was taken at RAF Lakenheath. And you can see the semi-cloudy sky. We didn't get a lot of sunlight in here.
You had to get above the deck.
That's actually a good day there because there's not, at least you got visibility over a mile. There were many times we couldn't fly for 4 or 5 days in a row because it was so socked in.
Well, we've got a good friend, Robert Laws, watching in Dundee, Scotland, and he's used to some cloudy skies up there. You flew over Scotland, I'm sure, a bunch of times. We got people all over the world watch our program here. Rick, are you still a private pilot?
Well, I have a complete set of licenses. After I got off active duty, I planned on flying for the airlines, actually, and I got an airline transport rating and all those things. But by the time I actually got off active duty, the airlines were in a collapsing mode, and they didn't do any hiring for almost 10 years as two things happened. Airlines were going through a lot of consolidation, and they also went from a three-person air crew down to a 2-person for the most part. And so they didn't hire much until about 90. I got out in 1980, just before STS-1. And by the time airlines started hiring, I already had a very good career going at the Space Center. And so I never bothered to go pursue that anymore. But I did pursue it for a couple of years. You wanted to fly
the friendly skies and take people around. That's very interesting. I'm also interested in some of the astronauts like Hoot Gimson, who at the end of their career become a pilot for Southwest Airlines, and several astronauts have done that. We threw this image in here, Rick, of the F-4.
Yeah, we flew a lot of missions and the fall exercises down over that's back during the Cold War in the 70s, and we flew low level through the valleys and stuff in Germany, and that's actually a lithograph there. But I flew through valleys and looked up the hill, uphill at castles that were above me when we flew. So that's a very reminds me a lot. Yes, it does. But very, very fun flying. That's a picture of the kind of combat gear we flew with. Had a vest with all kinds of survival equipment stuff. Of course, a G suit on our lower half to to pull the G's and stuff. But anyway, that was all Vietnam era stuff. But I did not actually go to Vietnam. Like I say, I got diverted to Europe and did most of my time there.
Yeah, winding down 74. I hear that. That's and shout out to you Vietnam veterans out there. Definitely, we never want to forget you. With all of this aviation background, I guess it was just a perfect segue for you to be involved with the Air Force part of the Space Coast here, the 45th Space Wing, that is responsible for the launches and so forth here on the Space Coast. Rick, tell us about your 14-year career with them.
Well, when I first got off active duty,
Lieutenant Colonel there.
when I first got off active duty, I thought I would go fly for the airlines, but when that didn't work out, since I was stationed at Patrick Air Force Base on my last tour, I took a temporary job, if you will, at the Space Center, because they sent me out there for an interview and I got hired right away. And that temporary job lasted for 30 years, the better part. But in the interim, I was going to try to keep my options to go to the airlines open, so I tried to get on with some flying units in the reserves, and most of them weren't hiring very much. It'd been a long commute anyway, and I found out there were some reserve positions at Patrick Air Force Base where they were looking for experienced engineers. And since I already had a couple of years under my belt with the shuttle as a civilian, they put me to work as a reservist supporting the 45th Space Wing. And when I first started, it was actually Systems Command, and they treated everything like it was R&D. And then while I was in the reserves, they transitioned over to Space Command. It was still all part of the Air Force, but it did change and it became more operational. And years later, of course, under the Trump administration, they moved to having an individual, total new Space Force.
There's our transition there. This is the range of the future, they call it, and that is the 45th Space Wing new Delta logo with a shuttle launched there in the background there. There's the Space Launch Delta 45 is what the people at Patrick Space Force Base are called. And I love driving by there all the time because you never know what you're going to see on the tarmacs there.
But when I first started with the reserves, the Air Force was giving up all their expendables and they were going to fly all DoD payloads on the shuttle. I don't know if you remember that, but that was where they were headed. And since I had shuttle experience, they had me working a lot of DoD payload stuff and interfaces with, so it went very well hand in hand since I worked shuttle every day and then I go do part-time duty with the reserves with the 45th. And later on, after we lost Challenger, then my mission with the 45th Space Wing changed because they were bringing expendables back in, and I was assigned to the 3rd Space Launch Squadron to activate the Atlas pad for the early Air Force launches with Atlas.
Rick is talking the expendables being the rockets that were expendable. They threw them in the ocean when they were done, not on the shuttle. Yes, you were in the transition, and here we have our Space Force emblem and the Space Force insignia there that we're seeing all over our Space Coast here now. You were in the transition between the arrogance of the shuttle being billed as forget your single stick rockets, everybody's going to want to ride our shuttle. And that didn't work out so good after the 25th launch, of course, of Challenger, and the shuttle lost a lot of payloads immediately as people went back to those single stick rockets that the 45th Space Wing, that was their bread and butter, is launching them, right?
Yes. And the Atlas didn't used to be an Air Force, well, I guess way back it did, but they hadn't been using Atlas. They used mostly Titans and Deltas, but as they came back off a shuttle, they added the Atlas to their inventory, and they launched all 3 of those as expendables when they came back up after shuttle with expendables.
Well, we have a question here. We're talking to Rick Davignon, shuttle engineer. He was director of several operations there and helped actually form the United Space Alliance. We're going to talk about that. We have a question, Marty.
Yeah, Rick, did you ever apply to be an astronaut?
Yes, I applied, and unfortunately, I hadn't gone to test pilot school, so I wouldn't been accepted as an actual astronaut. And I did have a master's degree that I had gotten while I was on active duty, but it was in business. So I didn't have a technical master's degree, so I wasn't qualified as either a mission specialist, and not being a test pilot, I didn't qualify as a regular astronaut. So I didn't get very far in the application process, but I tried.
Well, interestingly enough, Rick's going to tell us here in a little bit where he hired an astronaut, not to work as an astronaut though. So stay curious about that. Didn't give a shout out to Marty Winkle there, that's been running our Streamlabs program here. We are Rick, Marty, and I have done 711 episodes of Stay Curious Today in a 2.5 year period. And I'm so proud to call him my friend, and I couldn't do without him. You guys have been friends for a while, right?
Yes, I've known Marty for back in my early days. I don't remember exactly when I first met him, but it had to be back in the Rockwell days.
Were you one of those crazy runners that did the marathons?
I didn't do marathons, but Marty did an excellent job of organizing some things we call Beat the Boss on the beach, where we'd go down and run on the beach, and they'd make the bosses wear weird colored T-shirts, and everybody else would try to run them down and pass them by. Of course, the bosses tend to be a little older. And
Who were some of those bosses, Marty? Beat the Boss days.
Well, we had Ed Adamek initially. He was it was his idea to do this. But we had Mike McCulley, Brewster Shaw, Lauren Shriver, Rick.
Yeah.
Other bosses that you probably wouldn't know of.
Those were astronauts: Brewster Shaw, Lauren Shriver, Mike McCulley, and you said Bruce Melnick were 4 astronauts that you reported to off and on in the United Space Alliance days.
That's correct.
Well, let's talk about that. I'm going to throw up the USA logo up here so Rick can talk about the all the contractors that he worked for. McDonnell Douglas, Lockheed Space Operations. You were at Rockwell. You got paychecks from them all, it sounds like.
Well, didn't plan it that way, but that's kind of the way the contracts got transitioned from one company to the next. I considered myself very lucky because those were treated as rollover contracts, where we tended to keep our jobs, keep our seniorities, vacation time, and all those retirement benefits, whatever. A lot of contracts changed over before Shuttle, and I think to some degree after Shuttle, where people were flat laid off and they had to restart careers from zero. But mine were rollover type transitions, and that was very beneficial for an ongoing career.
Yes, one thing being involved for the last 5 years with the American Space Museum here and learning about your workers, contract workers out there. Of course, the first thing I learned was NASA didn't build or launch anything. All contractors did. NASA's the homeowner, and you hire all these people to do your things in there. But it's the morphing of these companies through decades, them buying out each other, and and it's I think it's a very interesting how people like yourself that rose to the top, they transition very easily in all of this. It didn't bother you at all who you were working for. You were still doing the same job with somebody else's name on your check, right?
Yes. And anyway, I consider myself really fortunate to have such a broad, varied career, and almost got laid off in '86 after Challenger, as Vandenberg also shut down. But I managed to stay continuously employed for over 30 years, which was a real good deal for me. And I started before STS-1. I got to watch STS-1. Actually, I don't know whether they slipped up or what, but we were actually on part of the VAB roof to watch STS-1. They locked that off. They learned, and they locked all those roofs off years later. But
you brought in your Rockwell launch of the Columbia, April 12th, 1986.
I look back at that launch, and I'm still amazed today. Like Artemis is flying unmanned for its first mission, which is typically the way it was done. But STS-1, first time that thing actually launched into orbit, had live crew on it. You got to give those two astronauts,
John Young and Bob Crippen.
Young and Crippen were just unbelievable to go on and take a mission on like
brave. Brave beyond belief. That's a good point, Rick, that I heard nobody point out during the Artemis launch that we did launch the first one. They're launching it uncrewed, and here we did not do that with the Space Shuttle. We're looking at a picture here of two shuttles between the OPFs, the oral processing facilities there. Just one of those fun days that happens out there, right? And you get to go out there and do a little rubbernecking, I guess.
Oh yes, that particular shot right there is very rare because you would see two of them outside a building like that close together at the same time. But it was a truly unique place to work because any given day you could go out to the pad and go up on the pad and look down if there was a stack out there. And just imagine this thing lifting off vertically in a couple of weeks, and it just left you fired up. Go to the VAB and watch them crane that thing up to the vertical and go mate it to the stack, or go over the OPF and go inside. The ECLS systems that I worked were all over the ship. We had stuff in the aft, the forward, and the mid body. And
now you threw an acronym out there. ECLS systems is what?
That's environmental control and life support systems.
Oh, that's pretty important.
And a couple of things that were critical about that system is it had all the atmospheric makeup and pressurization for the cabin was part of that system. Surprising, most of the components and the work that we did was temperature control. Most people don't realize how critical temperature management is in a space vehicle, but we had Freon coolant loops interfaced with water coolant loops that ran through the whole ship, so we worked the ship end to end, and I crawled through all the bowels of the ship doing modifications and repair and testing, troubleshooting at one time or another. And it was just incredible to go down and look at some of this hardware. The aft section was some of the most amazing stuff I've ever seen. It's just a engineering marvel to crawl down in there, see all the convoluted big lines for fuel coming in, hydraulic systems, and of course our coolant lines were all running in around that stuff, and all the instrumentation and wiring. And of course you had to be very careful crawling those areas so you didn't damage any of the wiring or step on any tubing and break anything. But it's just incredible to crawl into a place like that.
Well, I'm enjoying the enthusiasm from Rick Davignon here, a shuttle director for over 30 years. We hope that you're enjoying this program here because I'm learning some things and reviewing some things that I'd love staying curious about out there. Yes, the one thing that amazes me is how a lot of the shuttle, you couldn't walk in certain areas and so forth because for weight constraints, it was built to be in the weightlessness of space. So some things you could not walk on, right? And you had to have, there was a lot of support structures and so forth when you see in there.
Well, just an example. Could you switch back to that one that showed the two orbiters there?
Yes, sir, sure.
You'll notice there's two yellow structures bolted onto it.
Marty and I are fighting there. Thank you.
There, you'll notice
I was going to point those out.
Those are called strong backs, and those payload bay doors were very lightweight. They had radiators on the inside of them to dissipate heat. But those doors were so flimsy that you couldn't open them on the ground without having those strong backs on them. And when they were opened, they were attached to a 0G system, we call it, where it was cables with balance weights and things. So as the door opened with the door motors, those doors would open.
Wow.
So that's the kind of thing you had to worry about with lightweight space hardware when you try to operate it on the ground.
Well, those motors were geared for weightlessness too. So
yes.
They weren't the power that you would do on Earth. So
yeah, just very low power motors for a great big door.
Yeah, Marty that was inside of every lunar module that went to the moon. I'm always fascinated by him saying that the ladder that the guys walked down the ladder on the leg, you couldn't step on that on Earth because it would break. It was built for 1/6 gravity on the moon there. Everything, even though the shuttle was taking up massive payloads weighing tons, you still were weight conscious of things, weren't
Oh
you,
yes,
Rick?
everything was transferred through load points and things like that for during launch. But there's lots of very flimsy stuff on the shuttle simply because it was made to operate in zero G.
Well, there's Rick in his work environment, looking sharp, white shirt, tie, did you guys wear ties much? The Florida
Back then, I
casual
guess
thing.
in
I know they did in the Jiminy
we
holidays.
wore ties in management almost all the time up through the early to mid '90s. We had a new Space Center director that came online at the time, Jay Honeycutt. He came out of Houston. He wore a lot of just polo shirts and that type of shirt, and he encouraged us to loosen up.
Did he?
But yes, he did.
Well,
But
God bless you, Jay Honeycutt. He's a good friend of our museum, and I'll call him up and mention that.
but even so, there are always big time meetings when you went to meet with the customer and certain key things that happened. So even after we slowed down our formalities with how you dressed every day, I always kept a sport jacket and tie on the back of my office door, because you never knew when you're going to get a phone call to go down to NASA headquarters to talk to somebody, and they liked us to be formal when we went to see the customer counterparts.
Rick, you mentioned you had several offices around the campus at Kennedy Space Center.
Yes, when I hired in,
Where's that picture made?
this was in OSB 1, Operations Support Building 1, and when I first started at Space Center, my office was actually in the VAB in the annex, and it was very dark and gloomy in there with no windows. And you go to work real early in the morning, it'd be dark, and you got out at night, it was dark, and all day long, if you stayed at your desk, you never knew. So you always had to get out and go to the pad or go to the OPF or somewhere so you could at least get a little bit of sunlight through the day. But I had offices in the VAB. We had trailer complexes off and on. I had an office over by the OPF for a while. I had offices down in the ONC building. And of course, when I was on Air Force Reserve duty, I had offices at one time or another down at Patrick Air Force Base and all over the Air Force Cape side as well. So I got to see an awful lot of different facilities and office spaces.
So I'll bet one of the most important things for you was your briefcase. People don't carry briefcases around like they used to because we're all electronic. But when you mentioned having several offices, at one point in time, I actually had 3 different places in the museum that I had offices and then home. So I had 4 computer desks I worked off of, and I could say thank God for the cloud, because I could. But I'm thinking of a guy like you. You had your suitcase crammed with stuff, I'll bet.
Oh,
Am I right?
Oh yes, I wore out more than one briefcase. There's no doubt about that. But anyway, surprising enough, by that picture there, I was in management, and I had a very lucrative careers in management. But my most fun years were actually when I was probably a lead engineer, when I got to go out and do hands-on with the hardware.
All right.
Brand new guy, you get doing a lot of gopher jobs and things. By the time I became a lead engineer, I got to work on a lot of systems and stuff that was all by myself. And one of the things that we developed was a special cooling system we put in orbiters. It's for a radioisotope thermal generator, and we flew a couple missions that had spacecraft in them that was powered by those things. They were
Magellan and Galileo.
Yeah, they were deep space missions that solar panels wouldn't work, so they had to have other power source. But to put an RTG on one of these, you need to cool those things because they generate a lot of heat.
Didn't think about that, of course.
And as I told you, the system I worked, we took care of the temperature control of things. So I modified 2 ships, Atlantis and Challenger, were both earmarked to fly RTG missions. And we went through and added a whole nother coolant loop just for RTG coolant in both of those ships. And it was such a large mod that we put in that we couldn't do it in one turnaround float. And typically when you do anything to a shuttle, it has very carefully packaged mod that they would put in a given time, and everything was configuration control. But this was such a big mod, it was spread over several flights. And we'd put in what we could, and then we would tie everything down and
Let's see, that
cap
was
off.
in Atlantis for Galileo, because I know Mike McCulley was the pilot of that mission.
And I think maybe Discovery. But
Was,
anyway,
yeah.
when Challenger went down, one of the things that worried me is, as I was telling you, we put these kits in incrementally,
Mm-hmm.
and we only had part of the kit in Challenger. And when we got done with our OPF time, we capped off the lines, tied down everything, and took our configuration to a mission to a material review board, and they approved it to fly because it was not in a flight configuration that they could totally lock down. And of course it was a lot of engineering analysis and stuff to certify it, but it still wasn't like a full-blown lab tested configuration was supposed to be. So when we lost Challenger, I was very worried that partially installed mod that we had in Challenger was maybe part of the problem.
Oh,
And I was,
but it wasn't.
it
so-
wasn't, but still, when you have something, when you're operating a little bit unusual mode, it always
Yeah.
makes you wonder, and it
Well, you were
caused.
just dozens of engineers wondering
Yeah.
if it would be traced back to them, of
And-
course.
And oddly enough, I saw that event happen with my naked eye. That particular coolant loop that we put in for the RTGs used a water loop, and since water can freeze, we had a major valve panel, and we had a bunch of heaters on that valve panel, and I was in a firing room testing the heaters out on the Atlantis the morning of the Challenger launch, and we heard the countdown come out of the 10-minute hold. So I told my crew they could go outside to watch launch, and I secured everything, and I went up to look out of the window of the other firing room, and I was standing there watching the launch when the explosion happened. That was just really, really sickening.
Yeah, that's the word, sickening. January 28th, 1986 at 9 in the morning. When these events come up, we take the high road, Rick, and try and promote the astronauts and what great people they were. And Columbia was a very successful mission, of course. But you see it in everybody's voices and eyes, my friends, when these tragedies come up, like Marty and Rick were there, and it never conjures up positive memories. Well, let's move on to real positive memories. I was showing here you and your chums there. Marty and I fighting there. You take it over, Marty. Who we have here in this picture with you? Then we're going to move to, because I'm fascinated with the Vandenberg Air Force Base there. But there you are. That's a Rockwell logo.
That's early shuttle launches, maybe STS-1 or 2 somewhere in there, because we're wearing a Rockwell logo jackets, and that was before the contract was transitioned to Lockheed in 1984.
You remember the names your workers?
Yes, that's seated there is Matt Russo.
Hi, Matt.
And this was the ECLS console where we managed all our systems. We had 2 of those CRT monitors, and Steve Black is the gentleman in the blue hat, and I can't see who the gentleman is in the back. And of course, that's me on the left.
Did you know our docent? We have a docent named John Smith, and John worked ECLS on the space labs and HABs. He was in the payload bay.
Yeah.
I guess you were in the forward.
Well, if he worked Space Lab, I mean, I worked Space Lab, but I remember the name. He came into McDonnell Douglas after I came back to Shuttle in there.
Yeah, well, John's a. So Marty has a question from one of our Stay Curious watchers.
Yeah, we have a question, but before that, Matt Russo used to work for Grumman on a lunar module also.
Oh, okay. The guy in the hot-looking pants there.
Yeah.
All right.
And Mark Cusiak has a question, which is a good lead into your next series of slides. But Rick, did you spend any time at Vandenberg, and how close were they actually to fly from there if Challenge did not happen?
Well,
let's look. We got Slick 6 as our background here, and there's the beautiful complex of it out there. And we'll show you some more slides over here. Take it away, Rick.
Well, one of the things you'll notice is a radical difference in the terrain. Slick 6 was down on the south end of Vandenberg, and the processing facility for the shuttle and the place where they ferried it in and out the runway there was on the north end. And as they ferried a shuttle down to the Slick Six, they had to go down a mountain. There it is. You actually have a picture of that, but it shows it on the transporter going down towards Slick Six. But you don't have a shot there. They actually had to cut a groove into the side of the mountain. See how the wingtip sticks
Yeah.
over the side of
I
the,
should have
the
threw
road?
that in there. That's actually Enterprise is the
Yeah.
shuttle they're using there.
But anyway, that was about as far as they got. I spent some time in Vandenberg and doing some of the reserve work I did. The most consistent time I spent there was in '86 after we lost Challenger. Things slowed way down while the investigation was going on, and so they upped the effort we were putting into Vandenberg, and they sent a lot of us from KSC out to Vandenberg to help activate the Vandenberg complexes for all the shuttle processing and launch. And again, ECLS systems had activities at both, the horizontal processing facility as well as out in the vertical at Slick Six. So I had people that worked both places, and we had equipment on, and it was much the same support equipment out there that we had down in Florida. So we were trying to get all that certified and activated the summer of '86, and we spent a lot of time. We were getting somewhat close. There was still quite a bit to go. And then in the fall of '86, they decided that the Air Force needed to get back on expendable rockets. So we had more versatility in our launch capability as a country. And they canceled the Air Force shuttle launches. And all that work we'd done at Slick Six was put on hold.
Air Force essentially was going to own Discovery as their shuttle to, and what was so unique? Why'd they want to go out to Vandenberg, Rick?
Well, one of the things was the DoD uses a lot of polar launches, and Vandenberg is set up to do their polar launches, and they use Cape Canaveral I guess Space Force Station today to launch east-west type or east orbits. So you go around fairly parallel to the equator. But the polar launches are still done today, all out of Vandenberg, because if you look at the shape of California with the rotation of the Earth, as you come off the Western Test Range, if they have to detonate a vehicle, if something goes wrong, it'll splash down in the ocean just like it does in Eastern Test Range off here. And that's why Kennedy Space Center was selected where it was way back in the early NASA days, was so you could have a range and drop damaged hardware into the ocean. And
the interesting thing about this Slick Six was it was like a clamshell that the shuttle would be serviced in as that structure's pulled away, and the pedestal that was built for it to be launched off of, I was always kind of been intrigued by that. Our godfather of our museum, Charlie Mars, hey Charlie, was one of the NASA managers over this. And we've talked to Jay Honeycutt about that. One of the problems was getting the exhaust from the SSME engines that would ignite 6.6 seconds before the SRBs, get that exhaust out. And I was talking to Jay Honeycutt, and I said, boy, that was probably some really big fans that you were considering. He said, fans? We were using jet engines. Remember that?
yeah, we had jet engines to
move
manage
the flame out of the trench.
But that entire one of the things we learned at KSC was you're susceptible to weather damage. Even with pretty good weather here in Florida, there were some times we had weather damage, and so when they were building up Vandenberg, and the weather's much worse out there, they decided they needed that enclosure like that. So there was a lot of reasons they had to do things differently at Vandenberg.
What could have been, and there is two pictures of Enterprise on a fit check out there, and doing all the pretty pictures. Of course, Enterprise used by the ALT, approach and landing tests. And then there is a Slick Six with a Delta rocket, I believe, launched on there from that site there. Interesting segment of the shuttle history, isn't it, Rick?
Yeah, Slick Six. I don't know what it was originally built for, but it had a long history. I think there's some Indian burial grounds near there that they thought maybe had it hexed because they had several programs canceled off of Slick Six over the years.
Well,
But-
Doug Forrest is watching Stay Curious, and he's he's a sketch artist in L.A., a pencil artist in Los Angeles. He's probably visited there. We have Ophelia Sauterel's watching in Normandy, France. We to you, young lady. And William Whiting, hey Bill, he's up in Michigan. Mark and Tom Usiak, of course. Cliff Watson, good to see you. He's from Pomona, Australia. Carlton Bailey's a launch photographer. I have to ask Carlton if he's been out at Slick Six. Don't know if he has or not. Steve Hammer's watching. Pam Shivik. I was thinking you the other day, Pam. Let's get together in 2023 with a Stay Curious program. She's an astronomy friend of mine. Madeline Vanderlaan's watching. Rick Homer is watching. Ellen Brown. Hey, Ellen. You know Ellen Brown?
Yes, I know Ellen.
Well, Ellen and her husband both have been on Stay Curious, thanks to Marty. Good to see you staying curious with us, Ellen, and we're so glad the Artemis work that you've been doing is paid off. And Melissa Pope is watching us today on Stay Curious. So, Rick, you've had the opportunity to hire and fire people. I'm sure we won't talk about firing anybody, but you've seen the women come into the workforce.
Yeah, it's been amazing the things I've seen happen in my lifetime. When I first got in the Air Force, we didn't have women pilots. In fact, while I was stationed in Europe, it was kind of a milestone when we got our first female crew chief. And that was in the late 70s. And of course, things have advanced a lot since then.
They have advanced so much, Rick, that I'm throwing this cartoon up here to emphasize how much has advanced. The HR woman saying we're looking for someone who can do the work of two men, and the applicants saying, "Oh, so it's only part-time."
Anyway, they proved very capable, both in the military as well in all the things that we do in the civilian launch business.
Well, you hired someone who became an astronaut, and here she is.
When I came back from Vandenberg, that's when I got migrated into management. And one of the groups I had, when I was a first line supervisor, most of our management didn't have a military background. And so I was approached by our HR department that they had a naval aviator that they would really like us to hire. So they sent her to me to interview her and see if I thought she could do the job. So I got to interview this young lady named Kay Hire. Kay was in one of the first classes out of the Annapolis with a female, again, first. And
Navy commander.
Yes, and she set some records in some of the first as female activities in naval combat positions.
Has she?
Yes, she did. Anyway, by the time she got to me, she already had a track record established, and I was more than glad to hire her. She came to work for us and did a fine job as an
She was
engineer.
hired in as.
And she was hired in as just a systems engineer, much the same as I was, with a little bit of credit for your military experience, but still basically starting off as a new guy learning how to process shuttle hardware. And she did a lot of the same things that I did early on. And anyway, a few years later, she applied to be an astronaut, and she got selected as a mission specialist because she did have a technical degree as her master's. And she was the first astronaut selected with a KSC background. So I was real glad to see that for her.
We've met her a few times. Here she is with Mark Usiak. Beautiful Kay Hire there with, there's Mark. That's all we're going to say about him there. Marty, let's make that big there. There's Kay at the, I think that was an astronaut scholarship evening there, induction of the Hall of Fame guests there. And she's I've met her a couple times. Great lady. We'd love to get her involved in our Shuttle Fest in April and other things we're doing here. So, but obviously an overachiever in everything she's done.
Oh, she did great.
In there, so
I was proud to say I got to hire her and bring her into the space business.
Well, I'd say so. Have you talked to her?
Yes, I saw her at a reunion here just last month, and she seems to be doing well.
Oh, you saw her at the Rocket Reunion? Yeah,
Yes.
That's right. That's where I briefly met you at. Yeah, she was. She was once in a year in November. they have what they call the Rocket Ranch reunion, and all the people that worked at either Cape Canaveral or Kennedy Space Center show up and have a few adult beverages together, swap a few stories, and everybody's home and out of there by 8:30 to go to bed by 9:30, because we're all old, me included there. But Kay Heyer, we thank you for what you've done in our space program. What a unique individual. Just like Nicole Stott walked in and was working in your payload bays and so forth, and became an astronaut. Well, here we've enjoyed a wonderful conversation with Rick Davignon here. Rick, there is a USIAC, the brother USIACs. I told you they're incredible launch photographers. I don't know which mission that is. Tom will probably chime in there because he knows that beautiful water and reflection there. 30 years, it's been 10 years, actually 11 years since the last launch. What do you think about when you think about our these wonderful America's assets, these space shuttle orbiters that are now 3 of them in museums?
Well, I guess I am a combination of very happy and satisfied, but at the same time somewhat saddened. When I was in college studying aerospace engineering, we were landing on the moon. And time I finally got into the space business, I got to be part of the shuttle, which is a unique, different kind of mission altogether. A very fine piece of space equipment. It had unique capabilities, but at the same time, we couldn't get back to the moon. And my career timed out, unfortunately, before we could get to the back into the moonshots that we have going today. So that's the sad part, is I didn't get to be part of it before, and I'm not getting to be part of it now, other than I still live here.
We were talking in our little pre-production conversation here that the Artemis program, it's passed you by, and what would you have liked to contributed to it?
I'd have been content to do the same things I did, be a systems engineer and get out there and test the hardware, repair the hardware, and get it ready to go fly, set on the console and do countdowns and watch it go. Have successful missions. There's nothing much more fulfilling, immediate feedback kind of thing, to get that pat on the back, like going out and seeing a successful launch after you spent 3 or 4 months of prepping one to get it ready. It's just very satisfying.
That's a very interesting perspective there, Rick. And this launch, as I knew Tom would let us know, is STS-93, Rick. And 93 was July 1999. That is Columbia's 26th launch. That's the Chandra X-ray telescope with Eileen Collins at command of that. And Ashby was the co-pilot. They had their hands full, because that one of the engines, I know a little about that. The wires rubbed and shut off one of the engines. And then were you involved with the rewiring of the shuttles after this mission in '99? Because they took them all, basically rewired all of them. You remember that, though, right? I'm correct.
I remember the event, but we did a lot of retest in the ECLS systems itself, but we didn't actually own the wire paths. The wire paths were either instrumentation or EPD, electrical power distribution. So the wiring was provided as part of another system, and so that wouldn't have been my bailiwick. But of course, you change all the wires in the system, you got to do 100% retest of your mechanical system to make sure it's still working right.
Well, that's kind of a silly question of mine, because a lot of people like Marty say, hey, I had one job, I did that job. I didn't even know what the guy beside me really did, because he was so... we do have a cool little... I haven't seen the USA pencils that are shuttle-shaped there flying through our Stay Curious set here. And we have certainly enjoyed having Rick Davignon with us here. I really appreciate you spending your time with us. Is there something you'd like to share with our Stay Curious audience that I haven't asked you?
Well, there was one thing. Late in my career, I was associated with the chief engineer at USA, which was after everything had been consolidated. So it was truly program wide. It wasn't just the orbiter, it included boosters and engines and all the parts of the shuttle program. And one of the things the chief engineer liked to do was take us around to see various vendors that made really significant pieces of the orbiter. And we got to go see Rocketdyne, was the builder of the main engines at that time, and their facility out Canoga Park to see how they built up main engines. We went to places that built, all major parts of whatever system that was on. And I got to see some of the finest capabilities that we have to build space equipment. And I imagine it's even more so today, but a lot of the people we went to see had unique capabilities. It's probably the only place in the world that builds some of that kind of stuff. And it was just amazing and inspiring to think how our country had built equipment. And a lot of this stuff was the same vendors that had developed it way back in the early Apollo mission days for the first lunar.
Mm-hmm.
And they had evolved with different improvements to their processes and different materials, and of course much more integrated with computers depending on the system and things like that. But just to see the kind of capability that some of these people have, it's just incredible. And you come away having a really good appreciation for what this entire country is capable of doing. And I guess that's the single biggest thing that strikes me is just what it takes to do this kind of stuff. And we have those capabilities across the country like that to do it.
What do you think about the private companies standing on your shoulders and using the technology perfected by the shuttle era?
Well, I'm not that familiar with the true commercial stuff like what SpaceX is doing and some of the other companies, but you've got to give Elon Musk and SpaceX credit for being right on the tip of the spear with commercial stuff, what they've been able to do and do it so successfully.
Absolutely. We're poised to do 2 launches Friday within the same hour from Pad 40 and Pad 39A. And that would be the 50, if they both pull them off for the end of the year, 55 launches from the Space Coast. That's more than one a week.
Oh,
Did you ever think it would be that active?
No. Even with all the different kinds of rockets we had flying at different times. I think back on Shuttle, and I can remember when we were humping hard in 85. In one specific year, from like January 15th to 15th, we managed to get, I think, 10 flights out. But that wasn't even in a closed calendar year. And that was the best we could ever do.
Marty, we have a question?
Yeah. Mark Isiak is asking you, Rick, did you ever see a solid rocket motor test fire?
No, I've seen the shuttle main engines test fire, but I never got to a live firing of solids. I've been out and visited a thing called solid rocket operation out in Utah, but I never got to actually see them do a test fire.
I was going through, you brought your air crew checklist here. That's kind of got to send that for a F4C and F4D aircraft fair. That brings back some memories here. You even have some notes in there.
Yeah, I used to carry that when I flew the Phantom.
The barber poles and normal procedures and so forth. That's good stuff there. Well, we have enjoyed a wonderful conversation with Rick Davignon. We may have him back again. You're so full of some stuff that we didn't get through. I appreciate you indulging me on enlightening our Stay Curious visitors, watchers about the Vandenberg shuttle base out there, and we appreciate your contribution to our American space program.
Okay.
Well,
I enjoyed being here.
What do you enjoy in your retirement? Tell us how you're enjoying life.
Well,
in your family.
As I said, I started out, I grew up in the country, and
Kansas.
And I've got a place out in the country here on the St. Johns River, and that's where I spend a lot of time out there. It's just a couple acres, but it's a little more elbow room. It reminds me, I grew up in such a remote place, and some people will find this funny, here in Titusville, not a very large town at all, but My father came down to visit me. All those years he came to visit me while he was alive. He used to complain about the traffic in Titusville.
He did. Okay.
You know,
Well, they have a rush hour here. It lasts about 7 or 8 minutes, but nonetheless, it is on there. Well, again, give me another handshake because I really enjoy making your friendship. Anybody that brought Marty Winkle knows I know is a quality class person, and you have not disappointed me one bit. And hope to see more of you, Rick Davignon, in our American Space Museum. There's room for you to be a docent once a month here or something like that if you get a little edgy out there in the country. So, Marty, do we have anybody else that we need to say hello or goodbye to on our Streamlabs broadcast today?
Nope, we're good.
All right. Thank you, Connie McDaniel, for being there to help out. Thank you, Marty, for your always being here. 2 outstanding volunteers here at our American Space Museum, and we appreciate all that they do. So, Rick, happy holidays, Merry Christmas, and Happy New Year to you. And we will have a program tomorrow for you on exoplanets and talk a little bit about when you go out in your backyard, you're going to see all those stars. Well, guess what? There's more planets than stars up there in your night sky. So stay curious about that tomorrow, as I'm Mark Marquette saying, come join us, come to our museum, and stay curious so we can bridge the space between us.